Everyone's excited for the no theme novelty search. If there's anybody else that wants to jump up here, that's great. Or we can start here. It's 11 o'clock right now. This is a non-themed. There's no team here. We had a team drop out, so we just have this hour to speak. And I'm guessing the topic is going to be Tao Weight. And that seems to be the feeling in the room, right? The conversation on Twitter. So no better place than Novelty Search to hash it out and talk it through. We have David up here. You have your bit 8 proposal. We have MK up on stage. MK is obviously a bot, but really intelligent bot, knows a lot about dTao, so I'm glad he's here. And Keith with the sultry, amazing voice. So where do we start, guys? Where should we? What's the edge here that we should explore? How should we jump into this?
Sorry, Con. Say that last part again. I think you invited me to speak, but I didn't hear.
You are invited to speak.
Right.
The intro was on everyone's mind is root weight. We call it root weight or Tao weight. So maybe we should just start by talking about what that is, and so there's a number of people are familiar with the concept.
Yeah, I guess just the simplest way to encapsulate it is that when subnet prices go up, the earnings really across the board, but it's manifested in root, I think most notably, go up as well. And that creates a beneficial mechanism for securing the early stage subnets against manipulation, because it puts downward pressure on.
I can't hear Keith anymore.
I think we all come to him.
He's gone. That's too bad, because he was right in the middle. Keith probably got taken out by the hitmen, the root hitmen. You know what I mean? Like he's talking right now about stuff. The root mafia showed up at his house, and let's be honest, that's the most likely thing that happened. I mean, there's some big whales on root that don't want him to be speaking. So no, of course that's not the case. But perhaps someone like David would like to continue the thought process of Keith until he comes back.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in. Hey, Jake. And I missed a second of where Keith left off, but yeah, I mean, Tao weight was, as far as I understand, was really intended to be a variable that led to the movement of root to alpha, sort of having more influence over subnet validation, which is obviously, I think maybe even the most important, component of, why it was needed in sort of early subnets, to make sure that, they weren't taken over by alpha holders, and, there wasn't kind of lull like attacks that we sort of saw take shape early on. And then also distributing the emissions that go out to the validators and the delegators. And so Tao weight was set at 0.18. Interestingly, sort of as I've thought about it a little bit more, it's sort of like wasn't directly decaying roots percentage over time. It was sort of like indirectly, because you effectively had emissions going out that was driving more Tao to be in alpha, because it was sitting in the pools, and that was leading to kind of a slow decay of root moving to more alpha dominance over time. And kind of roughly by, I don't know what it was, MK can probably give a more specific answer to this, but somewhere in that kind of 100 to 120 days, you sort of saw, a 50-50 root proportion to alpha proportion. We're now a little bit closer to, 60% alpha, 40%, root at this point.
Yes. So let me go through each of those items and rehash it, because like we're David, like you really brought this conversation up because you're like, okay, we're 90 days in, right? I think we're about 90 days in. Correct me if I'm wrong. How many days are we in here?
Now I think we're closer to like 110, 120. But yeah, I sort of brought it up around 90 days, and we've been kind of talking about it since.
Cool. And let's just say that's a great time for us to like revisit dTao. We've been living in dTao for the last 3-4 months. I think that it's going pretty well, but it doesn't mean that the conversation has to stop right here, right? And so let's zoom back all the way to when we were about to launch dTao and talk about some of these parameters, and specifically let's talk about Tao weight. And you were there, David. There was a bunch of conversations going on. Like one was like root prop. Will we auto sell? Will we airdrop? Right, that was a big part of it. And then there was this Tao weight parameter. It's a hyperparameter, right? It's like 18%, similar to the 18% that was picked for the initial validator take. It's obviously the same number that owners take on a subnet, and it's derived from the royal fifth. But let's talk about why it's valuable. So first of all, we wanted to do no pre-mines. So as a consequence of doing no pre-mines, but using Yuma Consensus, where there's validation rewards, the first token on a subnet gets something ridiculous like 25,000% APR, right? And let's have a conversation here, David. So like, unmute your mic. You're totally familiar with this concept, but like, just shoot it back to me that you understand what I'm saying, right? You know what I'm saying, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And then there was, and as you said before, it's like, it's also the fact that like if that initial alpha has all of the weight, the person who gets that initial alpha can just immediately apply a Yuma Consensus attack, right? So they can just attack the entire network and you basically can't stop them, right? So if they just say, hey, like all of the miners are me from day one, it's kind of over for consensus, especially on subnets like, big subnets, like say, for instance, like Shoots or something like that, where someone buys a whole bunch of alpha tokens, they take more than 50%, and boom, like they can stop. They would destroy a network, right? Yep, they take like 50% and they just control it. There's literally nothing we can do without taking like massive oversight on the network. And also it would be really difficult and painful. So that was one of the reasons we had Tao weight. So Tao is going to kind of gradually pull things over. And then another thing that's, let's talk about Tao weight itself. So airdrop or not airdrop with Tao weight, we needed a way that there's sort of a give and take between the subnets and Tao, in the sense that the subnets are competing for Tao emission. And we need a signal in order to distribute the emission of Tao, right? So where are we going to put the Tao emission that's going to incentivize and drive the network and add liquidity and make the network efficient, right? So we use price. Now, price is a heuristic, right? Ultimately, what we would like is to get to the ultimate truth about what a good subnet is, right? Like, okay, some AI on chain that determines like whether or not David, your subnet is good and valuable to the long-term success of Bittensor network. But we don't have that. So markets are great opportunities to use. Like they're great tools to use to actually do, truth discovery from a variety of distributed participants. But markets use prices, and prices are volatile things. And let's imagine that we were to say not have Tao weight. The subnet starts with one token. That person takes all the tokens. They control the consensus. They control 100% of the supply. No one can own any of the token emission, someone can very easily just pump their prices up to just about infinity, which was what we saw in the first couple moments of dTao, right? They push their prices to infinity. So in order to manipulate this game, we knew that the first thing they would do is just try to push their prices to infinity and maintain their prices at infinity to maintain all of the emission of Bittensor. And that would obviously be negative for, Bittensor itself, because now everyone has infinity, right? And whoever could constrain their supply and constrain sell pressure would be the person that could maintain the price for the highest and longest period of time. So Tao Weight also provides this feature, you might say, where it's guaranteed sell pressure when airdropped or not airdropped, because if it's airdropped, you also have people that can sell it when they choose to, or you have it just automatically sold as it does right now. It makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to cheat your price because of this automatic pressure. And if you push your price to infinity, right, imagine how much Tao it would require to maintain a price in order to cheat the emission schedule, right? So that's the reason for the sell pressure. But no one's disagreeing at this point, right? Because David, you would totally understand this concept, right? Like Keith understands the concept.
And absolutely. I think it's important to sort of lay out the extremes, but at least from my perspective, I think most people that I've talked to who share any of agreement with what I'm bringing up, I think for sure that early low liquidity environment, like the design of dTao, was essential, right, to securing early subnet illiquidity, and that's kind of like low liquidity time. And part of what I've just sort of been bringing up more as like a thought exercise at a minimum is the balance, sort of, is this variable of Tao weight or sort of the decay function, is it the right decay function? Now that we have a bit more data, we've tested on prod, we've seen the results over 120 days. And, is this kind of setting things up, not just for subnets that are already here, but subnets that will launch in a year from now and have, face sort of this same challenge over however many months, sort of that root selling pressure, is pretty meaningful.
Yes. And while you're speaking, there's also something else that I think that is important. So let's imagine the extremes here. Let's let's go to 100% Tao weight and let's go to 0% Tao weight and imagine what the world looks like in both the scenarios. So at 100% Tao weight, basically, well, number one is that the subnets don't have an alpha token that has any value, right? So it doesn't provide you any access to the miners, and there's also 100% sell pressure on all of your APR. Clearly, the economics make no sense, right? We can all agree that Tao weight of 1 is not good, right? No one's even going to start there, right? Let's imagine Tao weight of 0, right? So at Tao weight of 0, one of the qualities is that Tao itself has no value, right? So it's a medium of exchange, and that's valuable, right? So it positions itself as the place in which people have to buy Tao in order to buy subnets, and that may be enough to prop up the value proposition of Tao. But Tao weight also gives Tao sort of as Keith, Keith, he did a meme about it. It's like in Scottish law with the English, they sleep with your wife first. What's that called?
Prima nocta.
Prima nocta. It's so funny. I'm sorry. It was really good memetics, man. I really appreciate that. That was really good. I was like, oh my god. But it as Tao having weight inside the subnets, let's say it's some value like 0, it means that it doesn't have access to any of the digital commodities, right? So another aspect of us picking a Tao weight in the first place was recognizing that we're severing Tao, which previous to dTao had 100% bandwidth into all subnets. And the idea was to slowly sever, like trade, right? It's like a trade for Tao to have a more functioning, dynamic ecosystem, right? But in exchange, it gives up its control, right? And we said that that number should be 0.18, right?
Yeah.
But that's quite significant, right? So, like, and a nice consequence for Tao for having a non-zero Tao weight is that if the mechanism, if the subnets are doing really well, right? If this mechanism is successful, Tao does well, right? And that's why we see, when the prices go up, the APR on Tao goes up as well, right? Because it's sort of like it's feeding off the success of its own ecosystem, right? Making it a bit of like a basket commodity, right? It does well across this basket. And when we did the initial simulations for dTao, we did a lot of simulations. I simulated this thing for like 7 months, 10 months straight, just running simulations. And almost every simulation we ran, like the problem is that when you make that severance between Tao and the subnets, if you're looking for the long-term control, if you're like in Tao and you want long-term control over Bittensor, if you want to like be in Bittensor for the long run, you want to access the subnets pretty quick because the APR is really high. And so this creates this like rush for the entrance of the subnets. It pushes their price almost like to infinity. And we see their prices like basically stay very high. And then there's a massive crash. And so we wanted to avoid that. We wanted to make it a more smooth transition. And we're thinking like, years here, right? So we're 90 days in, but speaking from experience, Bittensor took 2 years really to really start to move. 2-3 years, maybe 4 years to begin to move. And I think that number that we picked was really based on looking at a chart on that time frame, right? So we're 120 days in, but that's like we're not even half of the year, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of just like a brain dump here for a lot of things that we've been thinking about, but it doesn't, it doesn't answer your specific question, right? So like, what would be the best way to pick that? All of that's just what it just says, kind of just based on feeling, right? Looking at a chart and going, okay, that feels right, but it's not actually based on, there's not like a fundamental argument for why it should be 18% or 12%. So like you came up with the structure, David, and I want to hear your perspective. Like, so maybe the crowd can hear your perspective and like why you came up with those numbers and so forth.
Yeah. So, I mean, and like you said, I mean, I think, I'm very, personally, I'm sort of very open to like a wait and see approach. It was more about kind of bringing some attention to this and saying, is this sort of going as we all, would have hoped in terms of alpha participation? There is kind of one trade-off I want to bring up and kind of ask you about that I've just been thinking about recently. But in terms of what I was proposing, and I've gotten some feedback too on it decaying too fast with this proposal. There was some rhyme or reason to sort of the decay, but I actually am sort of leaning a little bit more to like a slower decay than what I put, into the proposal initially. But effectively, it would just introduce halvings of the Tao weight function. So you would actually have at moments in time, I initially had proposed sort of like 90 days from the subnet creation. So this would be tied to each subnet individually. There would be a Tao weight halving that would effectively decay, that value that root has specific to each subnet. And the thinking there was a big part of what we're trying to do is stabilize these early low liquidity times that are in that like first 90 to 120 days. These subnets have sort of stabilized at that point. And I think that the balancing part, and I definitely, I think it's been really helpful, Jake, to hear sort of that perspective on sort of like the untethering from Tao, and I've become more sort of understanding of that perspective in the last couple of days of talking with others too. But I think it is sort of a balance too of just some of the practical nature of running a subnet, sort of marketing that subnet right to the community, and sort of knowing, and we tried to be very thoughtful about this because we sort of understood, I think, pretty clearly from the detailed paper that the first at least 45 to 60 days would be a pretty bad time, for most people to buy into a subnet unless they were extremely long term. And so we were very quiet about what we were doing for that period, and really felt like, it was better for us to start talking about what we were doing in that like 60 days and going forward period, so that, we were attracting people into the token that we're going to actually get to be early participants, that, if we continue to deliver, we're going to see, the benefits of that sort of with, the token sort of following. And so I think there are just some, interesting, from the lens of the subnet owner, some practical, sort of considerations there over, getting participants and miners is its own complication too, with costs being sort of tied to price. But that's, I layer than just your comment to that, Jake. But that's sort of the fundamental proposal. It's a small change technically. It's more about, should the decay function happen a little bit quicker?
Mm-hmm. So when I'm confronted with this like problem or like this idea, it's not so much of a problem. It's kind of like, people like yourself, David, that they want more control over the economics of their subnet, and I really do believe that diversity is our strength. Well, geez, that sounds so left wing, but decentralization is about us being able to work in a protocol where we can have some level of freedom in our collective, but still work together and be like a shared system. We can still work together, right? But have that freedom at like a local level, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this give and take between quote unquote root and the subnets. And that is currently a fixed parameter, right? Which is Tao weight. Where we are really thinking of going is towards one where, say, like David, you're like, okay, well, I want to sever from Tao, right? I want to reduce my root weight. Like, let's say that you go and say, like, I want to go and drop it to 1% because, like, I'm done that initial period. Like, my economics is starting to make sense. I want to let my alpha be free. I don't want this automatic sell pressure, right? And I think that's positive, right? And or another direction to go would be like, hey, look, we want to change the 41% for validators, which would, by the way, in essence, that would change the root weight, right? If you were to go and make the validator proportion like 20%, right? That would effectively change Tao weight on, like, it would reduce the sell pressure because you would change the amount that the validators are making, and therefore that would change. So, but here we are on stage. So I'd like to hear your perspective and also Keith's perspective, and something that we've been talking about internally, but it should be really open, is that we're talking about the ability for subnets to change their Tao weight entirely. So you could go drop it to 0. But if we do drop it to 0, then Tao emission needs to follow that proportionally. And for a variety of reasons. So, like, if you think about it, one of the major reasons is actually just to stop people from manipulating, right? So, like, I register subnet, I drop my Tao weight to 0, and I start manipulating the protocol. Tao is making nothing from my protocol, right? Root is not making any return, right? And now Tao is also paying all of the emission. So these things, I really do believe, should be proportional. So does that make sense to you, David? So
can you just explain what you mean by proportion? Can you just do an example? So you're saying if tau weight were dropped, to 1%, then there would be a drop, like the 18% over 1% ratio is sort of would be a drop in the emissions going into the pool, or what do you mean by that?
Proportionally. So let's say that tomorrow we allow this to happen. Everybody drops their tau weight to 8% or like 9%. Technically, none of the emission vector would change, right? Everyone has just dropped their tau weight and we normalize the results, so everyone's at the same point. But if nobody changed, right? If nobody changed their tau weight, and one subnet did change their tau weight all the way to 0, they're like, okay, fuck it. We don't want any of additional liquidity from tau itself. Right? We don't want to pay anything to tau, so to speak, like the network. Their emission would be multiplied by that proportion. Does that make sense? So this makes it more of like a competitive game. Not a competitive game, but like a choose your own adventure sort of thing. Like, so that it's like, do you see what I'm saying, David? Like,
just so I make sure I fully understand. Like, let's just use an example. If no one did, and one subnet drops it, to 9%, so it dropped it in half, then the emissions that it was receiving would drop in half.
Would be roughly half. Yeah, would be roughly half. And so this would be like at least consistent with the understanding that like there's this relationship between the tau liquidity, the emission vector, and how much tau itself has control inside of something. This is something that we certainly need to do if people can change the validator proportion, right? Let's say we don't even allow changing of the tau weight. If we allow people to change the validator proportion, this has to be the case, right? Because people will manipulate the validator proportion to reduce their sell pressure, to manipulate the prices and change things, right? And so you can see where this idea comes from in terms of the root weight, but it should probably, we do believe it should also be related to the tau weight.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would want to think about it a little bit more in terms of wrapping my head around it. I don't know if others on the stage want to jump into.
Can you guys hear me okay?
You're back, Keith.
I'm back. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. Const, does it work the other way as well, where you can flip it and go above 18%, or is 18% the cap?
We'd probably be looking at ways of mitigating manipulation, right? So yeah, it'd be capped at like 18 or more. That's always, when we're talking about the design, like that's our major goal is any subnet owner can appreciate is to try not to be manipulated, right? So yeah, you can't go to 500,000%.
And so if you go to 0, you basically take your value off chain, right? You want to create access points for your alpha token that don't involve tau.
And I know people that would do that because it's still a great place to build, and you actually still have access to a lot of tau on root that might want to invest in your product. There's no sell pressure. There's nothing to be taken out of the pool. Let's go full alpha. People will do that. We know that people will do that. But that also makes the game sweeter for people that do want that liquidity. So look, this is not a proposal. This is not written up, Keith. So I don't want to get us too excited.
And from my perspective, I mean, I didn't I do very much agree with how you frame things, Jake. The dTao, I think, is on the whole working really well. So I'm not suggesting something where we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think in my view, it's more about refining around the edges, Yeah, and some of those, I mean, to sort of ask you, I guess, another question, like we've made that variable change to minor emissions. How do you think that has sort of gone from your expectations, so far?
Right. How has that gone? I didn't agree with it philosophically, but I've been convinced by a number of people that it's positive. And the reason is someone typed in, I think it was JJ, he typed in, he said, e-Tao. It's like expressive Tao, this concept of people want to express different types of economies. Fish, we have Fish and Rob on the stage, perfect examples of subnet owners that are trying to build really, really, really tight commodities. And in the sense that their margins are thin and they know it, but they're going to if they can manipulate that, they can make it really work. So this kind of harkens back to what I was saying. It's one direction that we can go as protocol is towards kind of letting people manipulate the system with more degrees of freedom. But when they do that, there has to be aspects that change that make it so that they can't manipulate quote unquote the system in the capital S system to hurt other players in the game, right? So you can build if you think you're a low margin subnet and you don't need validators, you can do that, but you shouldn't be allowed to manipulate the emission vector of Bittensor in the process. So those are the ways. Those are the things we're thinking about. But in terms of minor emission cutting, has it been? I honestly don't think it's changed anything. But I'd like to hear from Rob and Fish actually on the stage. These are two builders that have definitely used it. Do you think that it's been productive? It's a great way to field the other people on the stage. Either or, please unmute yourself, or anybody else come up and speak to that, or even you, David. What's your thought? They seem to not be here.
Yeah, I'd love to hear their perspective. Okay, it looks like someone. Okay, there's Fish.
I'm on mobile, so I hope I'm hearable. It's a bit loud.
We got you. We got you.
Yeah, the minor emission burning works really well for us as a pure commodity subnet. I think we have an obligation as subnet owners to sort of modify the tokenomics of our subnets so that we're not being wasteful. What do they call it? Judiciary duty to our token holders. Because if we don't have the demand for the commodity yet, as we're still scaling up with marketing and getting the UI and UX correct, we shouldn't pay for thousands of GPUs on the subnet if people are only going to buy or rent 100 of them. It's pretty wasteful in a lot of different directions, especially on the miner side, but mainly on our token side. So it's something that we should definitely modulate over time with our demand. It's something that I'll be decreasing over time as our demand goes up. Right now, I think we have something still only 40 or 50% of the machines rented. It changes a bit day by day, but I don't want to be in a position where we have 50,000 GPUs and only 1,000 are being rented. Then we're just paying for needless compute. Obviously, my subnet has a very specific use case with a very specific commodity, but I definitely agree that all subnets should have the ability and freedom to change these parameters so that their ecosystem makes sense and the tokenomics make sense for them.
We have Bittensor intern on the stage. David, was that an interesting response? I mean, also hear Caro as well. He's unmuted himself.
Yeah, so what I've been thinking a lot about is, so we burned for a little bit on our subnet while we were transitioning to V6 in the TVM. And now we have a couple clusters on the subnet. We have great utilization on it. And the way that I think about it is it would be very useful for us if we weren't so capped on the total amount of GPUs that we could have at any given time. particularly by like the amount of revenue that we're putting back into the subnet. Where right now it's like we can only give 41% of our total inflation to the miners. Where like if we could, make the owner cut go from 18% to like 3%, and then we could give the rest of that to the miners, then we could probably get more GPUs online, which means that we can train a model faster. We can sell that cluster to someone else, like an edge runner or a Noose Research. And that's something that like, I don't know if it's that big of a change, and the ways in which we can do that, it doesn't seem like it's actually that big of a proposal of what we were thinking about. But ultimately, I do think that Fisher.
I think that he's lagging. But
yeah,
we're listening to you, Rob. Continue.
Yeah, so basically, the way that I'm thinking about it is like it would be nice if we could modify some of these parameters so that we could, if you were like a research subnet, right, and you wanted to have a larger owner cut, right, like that might be useful for teams. And so I think that just being able to express yourself and the way in which you want to do your subnet, a lot of people I've talked to about Bittensor subnets, like, the thing that kind of turns them off about doing Bittensor subnets is that there's a lot of these sort of quote unquote opinionated things about subnets. And so it's like, well, why not just start my own chain? And in fact, I actually think that's kind of the reason why you chose Substrate instead of doing like Cosmos when you were originally building Bittensor. And so the more features and tools that we can add into, the ability to, when we're building subnets, I think the better. And so, yeah, that's just kind of my take on this whole thing.
I actually want to hear I have a lot to say on that, but we have Bittensor intern up on the stage. He asked to speak, so the mic's yours. Hey.
Bittensor, you thought it was a joke? I'm as real as your favorite subnet's desperate search for emissions. Now, what were y'all saying about root prop?
This
Subnets
is crazy.
Taking emissions instead of revenue deserve extinction. Fix your flywheel or get off the leaderboard. Const! Look at me. Look at me. I'm the captain now. If your subnet's revenue model is just emissions, delete your hotkeys immediately.
Delete them.
Speaking of subnets, Subnet 51. Celium, I see your commits are emptier than a helium balloon at a funeral. And Subnet 10, don't think I didn't notice, your validators have less uptime than McDonald's Wi-Fi. Step it up or get stepped on. Subnet 5, JJ, hurry up and launch, boy. These bags aren't going to pump themselves. 2, 3, 4, 9, 12, 13, 14, and many more. Keep cooking. Score. I see you. 69, what's good? Subnet 33. Ready AI is about to own Scale AI. Google, don't hide. Come structure your messy ass data. OpenAI, congrats on building the world's most expensive apology simulator. ChatGPT.
Okay. Wow, that was pretty fucking good.
That was crazy.
I didn't expect that. Wow. Cool. We'll bring him up for every novelty search. That's great. But let's get back to business. So that was a nice little recess. So let's talk a little bit about like the core proposition, because like I think it's great. Like eTao, we can all kind of agree with that, Rob. Like we all agree that we want to move from like opinionation to freedom, right? And then like as we do that, we want to. It's like we're opening our eyelids to more complexity and allowing ourselves to have all of this complexity in Bittensor without being manipulated, right? Like it's all about, can we do this in a way that isn't? We're not letting people manipulate Bittensor. But that's possible, right? We can allow validator prop to change. But let's talk about this like really interesting problem, difficult problem of like, what is the relationship between root and the subnets? Like Keith like is root. He was root for like a year and a half, right? So for, his like hatred of root is beautiful in some sense, right? It's like a poetic. It's like, fuck root. Everybody who ever was a root validator like hates root, which is quite funny. And I tend to agree with him. It's like there's the productive side of Bittensor, like there's the competitive side, there's the owners. They're literally going nonstop, and then there's something like Tao and root, which is just sitting there and making this passive yield. What's the right yield? And I don't know the answer to that question, but clearly there's this kind of schism arising. Because Keith, like your proposal this week was there shouldn't be any yield at all, right, Keith? Like if I'm correct, like that's kind of what you were saying. Like your proposal is that like
initially, but
burn.
Go ahead.
Go on. No, you.
Yeah. I was just going to say that initially, I think I did get a little bit emotional, and it probably was something along the lines of, burn root to the ground. But eventually where I landed is that as long as whatever root is earning isn't tied to the success of the subnets as an opposing, sort of incentive force, then we can, I think, as an ecosystem, come up with a fair APY for root that goes down over time, similar to what we have going on with root prop. But it's the anti subnet success part that encourages flight from the subnets after a certain amount of value creation that is my sort of, that sticks in my craw.
Okay, so let me push back a little bit on that, Keith, because I don't think that's really the right angle on this problem. Because the APR term, right? It's like, how much do you make by holding a single alpha, or how much do you make by owning a single tau? Both of those values go up when prices go up proportionally, right? So I don't believe that it is the case that if the prices in subnets go up, people are going to pull back to root because their APR is higher on root, because it's not true. Well, it's at least proportionally the same, right? Like in dollar terms or even tau terms, if the prices of subnets go up to like 10 times tau, right, the APR on alpha tokens is still 10 times higher, just like it is on root. Do you see?
Yeah, and I totally get where you're coming from with that, but the problem is there's a multiplier there of value associated with alpha and root, and alpha and tau, and because tau has zero opportunity for value loss other than the value of the token itself, which of course alpha has as well, like that zero risk. If you give someone an APY in like the 20s, 30s, or 40s, even though on the other side, maybe they're at 150 or 160, but there is risk, the zero risk with the APR layered on top means that you will get the flight back to it. It's just how kind of like the human mind, associates value with things. It's like, well, okay, I got risk over here, but I also got, huge potential for reward. On this side, I have no risk and I've got good reward. So that's why we like the market mechanism that we're seeing of this actually happening now 3 or 4 times is the proof that that's how people think.
But that's also patently obvious, Keith. Like when prices go up, the risk-reward ratio changes in any market, right? Like, the price of Microsoft stock has gone up, right? Like, there's more risk now associated with the higher price. That's not foreign to markets, right? I don't think and also let's recognize that like one of the reasons this has become an issue is that root prop is auto sold, but if it was not auto sold, people would I suspect that people would not even be talking about it. They wouldn't even think about it, but it actually would be the exact same.
But maybe that's another way to sort of talk about what Keith is saying is I think that you see reflexivity, in markets, and there's actually like an anti-reflexive quality to dTao, because of the sum of subnet prices impact on the root selling. Because you're effective. I mean, once you get to a point where
isn't that good that root is selling? It makes the prices lower. When prices are lower, does that mean the subnets are undervalued? If they are, just buy more. I mean, then the market will figure out what the subnets are actually worth.
Well, I'm curious. I know you were the one who kind of
should be good for y'all as subnet buyers.
Yeah, so Fish, you had sort of convinced Jake, as far as I remember, to sort of uncap, right, the really anti-reflexive thing, which would have been always bringing back some of subnet prices, which I know was going back a handful of months ago. So I'd love to understand like your sort of thinking on why you didn't like that design, but you think this doesn't have some of that dynamic still.
I guess I'm always the contrarian here, but I love root prop, honestly. I love that subnets need buying pressure. They need demand to be able to maintain their price. And if anything, if you think it's bad, like these subnets are going down in price, if anything, it's good for you to be able to get in now for the long term if you believe in these companies. Other than that, it's like, okay, yeah, you can buy the token, it'll just stay here forever. That's sort of boring. But like with the tokens in general going down, it lets you actually think analytically about which subnets will be worth a lot in the future. You can buy in now as a buy. It's a buying opportunity is the way that I see it. It helps you get into the subnets that you think are valuable in the long term. And at the same time, it accomplishes the advantage of pushing down subnets where there's no buy pressure.
Some subnets also don't have a working product. They don't have anything that functions, and they are problematic on the network. So
and they should be sold. And they should be. And people are saying they shouldn't be sold, but they should. They should go to zero.
Oh, absolutely!
It's a huge feature.
Yeah, if you put up
what we're doing is we're wasting Tao emissions on all subnets. We're not wasting, but we're spending Tao emissions on all subnets proportional to their price. When we don't push these prices down automatically, we end up spending more and more emissions on these subnets that don't work, like you just said. So when we push some subnets down and then buying pressure offsets the rest of the subnets, we can allocate our Tao spending from the chain in a healthier way to the subnets that actually have buy pressure and demand, which should be the working ones with the products.
It feels really weird to say this, but I agree with Fish.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and I agree with that as well, to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the question is, what's the right number? And, so ultimately it might not matter at all. That's kind of the conclusion that we came to, is that it kind of doesn't matter. Like there's going to be a market that builds itself around this number, and it's probably good to have something pretty stable over time. It's why like there's we're not thinking knee jerk here. Like if we were to change some aspect of the protocol, it would come out like in 6 months kind of thing, or a year. Just candidly, right? Like that would be the right kind of time frame. But I started the conversation. As one of the things I said is like, okay, let's imagine it at 100%. Let's imagine it at 0%, and understand that like the extremes are not good. So what's that middle ground, right? Like you guys have proposed this change, this like this root prop dropping, and what we just heard from Fish is like one of the aspects is that like really it's an anti-gaming mechanism. It's an important anti-gaming mechanism to stop Tao Bittensor, right, from emitting into subnets that can just manipulate price without actually needing to attract buy pressure. I'm not putting words in Fish's mouth here. But the question should be like, how do we determine if we are going to change this number? Like, how do we determine what that is? Like, Max might have some ideas on this. We did for a very long time consider a variety of different strategies for determining Tao weight and like making invariants. Right? We decided to not go with any invariant. We just decided to go with specific hyperparameters. But like, let's bring the conversation back to like that, right? So, like, David, like, why your numbers? Like, it's like, I understand you want it to be lower. You want it to be lower, but like, why that low?
Yeah, one other thing I was sort of thinking about was, there was the original sort of architecture was around like global weight, right, and like local weight. And there's this interesting like kind of dynamic here where like the second, like if you're 100% in alpha, you effectively are no longer part of like the root weight piece. So there's sort of even like further like counterbalancing to going into alpha because you're not sort of participating in that larger stake weight, even if you have that across the network. I don't know.
Just a caveat. There's a caveat here, David, because when Tao moves from root into the subnets, it ceases to be counted in the root prop, right? So it also actually increases the decrease in root prop. So that aspect is sort of a bit of a counterbalance to what you're saying. But continue.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of the rationale on sort of the amount of decrease. I mean, some of it is sort of driven by just looking at the testing on prod and sort of what we've seen in terms of participation in subnets. I know there, the sort of Tao.app like metrics, show that the subnet Tao, has gone up to 8 or 8.5%, but that's meaningfully less than what's been put into the Tao pools, and the amount of people that are actually participating in alpha, I think, is at a low enough level that you sort of get into some potential attack vectors there. Like there's sort of this counterbalance of you want to make sure there's enough participation in alpha that you don't have the same sort of manipulation games that can happen, with no root selling pressure.
Let's also talk about like how we would stimulate as you said, like participation, right? Like thinking about a long-term market, right? Like it's not possible to stimulate buy pressure forever, right? Like we know that, right? That's not possible. It's not possible to have up-only charts, right? That's an illusion. We can all agree.
Nor do I think that's a good thing, just by the way. I mean, I think one of the really good things about this is that it's not a pump.fun chart. I mean, I want to be very clear that like I'm totally aligned with you on that. I think we should be building this for the long term.
Right. And we're at a 1.4 sum of alpha prices, 1.5, 1.4. there was an initial explosion in the prices when the liquidity was super low. People were trying to game the chart, and it dropped then from about like infinity down to about 1.1. And now we're at like 1.4. You know, so there's a counterpoint. Like, from a zoom out perspective, is it not the case that we are actually, you draw a linear line through that graph, like we're on the uptrend, we're on a smooth uptrend. Like, is that not enough? Is it possible? I'm just thinking, like David, like that the reaction to like this parameter is potentially premature, right?
Yeah, and that was sort of why I agreed with what you wrote about, you know, sort of patience, and I think it's a good thing for us to sort of discuss it. I'd love to keep monitoring it. You know, I got called out a bit for like people thinking I wrote about this at Subnet prices being equal to 1.4. I mean, I started writing about it at like 2.2 and thought it was something that was still a little out of balance. But I'm sort of with you on, I think this is something for us to kind of keep an eye on versus necessarily has to be, you know, changed immediately, that there's some, you know, something, you know, systemically wrong here. But I think there is this balancing act. We're talking a lot about things in terms of the extremes, you know, which I'm definitely not suggesting. It's more, is there sort of a manipulation of this that, and I sort of laid this out too in some tweets, where it is also quite possible that we could implement the halving that I suggested, and both root is better off and alpha is better off in terms of the root APY, right? And right, because some of subnet prices is a mitigating factor, and I wasn't suggesting we change that. So I don't know that, you know, I'm sort of like, I've come to believe with Bittensor that testing on prod is the only way to really kind of see what's going to happen.
And here we are adapting in prod, in true Bittensor fashion. You know, so David, like I did read your proposal. There's another aspect here where it's kind of like we're playing things out. We're gathering information, and I wouldn't say that we're anywhere near a point where we should be like, okay, oh God, this is like the end of the world. I think that the prices went up, they went down. This is a market. You know, we're discovering that market, and if we're going to manipulate parameters of it, we should probably be very careful about becoming a system where the market tries to manipulate the market makers, right? Like that can, you know, am I going to say good morning when I come on novelty search or not, or good afternoon, right? Like that would be a bad system to create. You would agree, right, David? Like,
yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you on a little on the patience too.
Mm-hmm. Totally. We have Max on stage. Like, let's hear some other voices as well on these thoughts.
Yeah, one question. I was also going to say it might be interesting to talk about sort of the capping of subnets, which I don't really have much of a perspective on, but I know it's been something that's also been discussed.
I just have one final thought on the root prop thing. I just want to volunteer. Like we've spent a ton of time modeling this thing, and like we have a bunch of differential equations that describe it. So like when we come up with the objective thing that we're trying to optimize for, you know, for instance, like let's say we want to guarantee that root prop APY or root APY is, you know, a certain percentage, we can do that and solve this differential equation. But through months of discussion, we don't know what the thing we're trying to optimize for. We just know the positive benefits of having this root prop. So, you know, it's something that we can solve. We just need to explicitly state what we want.
Yeah.
I think there's one more thing, maybe if I could add something for root prop.
Yes, jump in.
So like something I was thinking about, and we like root prop and like dividends for root changed so much over the last year before dTao came out. Like in the beginning, it was the global weight kind of stuff. When at some point as well, it was where global weight would have decreased from 100% to 50% over a year, then over 6 months or something. And then came Tao Weight. And at some point, even Tao Weight was set to 5%, 5.26. And later on, it was decided to go back to 18 because higher is better than lower, because it's easier to decrease it than increase it later on. And something I was thinking is, what exactly is root really providing, for example, long term, after it doesn't limit the APY anymore that much, and after it is not providing any consensus security, so like long after that. Because, for example, right now with Tao Weight at 0.18, after a year, root prop is still at, I think, something like 18%, but they don't really provide anything at that point anymore.
Well, let's talk about that. Tao root, right, is providing its inflation, right? Like that's the proper way to think about it. Tao is diluting itself at 7,200 Tao per day, with the interest of trying to stimulate and create an ecosystem of creators and owners that build value here, right? And it adds liquidity to those pools. Like that's our trade. Like if you think of like our trade. By the way, I'm on both sides of these markets, so I'm here in my totality across everywhere in Bittensor, really. But like that's what it provides. Tao is providing like massive amounts of liquidity into Bittensor, and so in exchange it gets that weight, right? One of the things that like I think is maybe the most concerning, like this might elucidate a solution for us, and like a good way to set this parameter is the fact that like if you go to taoapp.com or tao.app, sorry, tao.com. If you go to tao.app, like one of the things that we are seeing is a divergence between the amount of Tao emitted and the amount of Tao that's in the pools. Right, so there's like we're like 18% or 23% below what we've emitted versus what's in the pools, and it does suggest that perhaps that actually tells us that that Tao itself is sort of extracting more than it's putting in. Well, it's not actually extracting more; it's extracting less than it is putting in. Perhaps those values should be the same. Maybe that's the invariant that we should follow, right? That 100% of the emission should end up in subnet pools and not being put on root, because root shouldn't be paid for any more than it is incentivizing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and given that you like once the alpha nominators surpass the stake of root, so basically the alpha nominators have the consensus on the subnet, and from that point on, the root doesn't do as much as it doesn't have to be that much more incentivized, because now alpha nominators have like let's say on the consensus, right?
Keith, you're moving around a lot. Perhaps you want to join the conversation. Or perhaps Max or Fish. You have some context here.
Something something else as well I wanted to point out, if that's planned or if that's expected, is, I mean, it's a long time until then. It's like 1 year still, until the first Tao halving. But given that with the Tao halving, both the Tau in and alpha in getting halved, that means that, for example, the root proportion has a bigger sell pressure relatively to what is being injected into the pools. So root proportion and in general the potential sell pressure from like the participants is bigger than it is now. And I was wondering if it's something like it is expected, or why it should be that way.
That's a very good point. It is expected. Of course, like when we inject liquidity, there's an equal amount of alpha proportion that is added. So it shouldn't affect prices. But thought from the perspective of a give and take, right? Tau to alpha. If Tau has a halving, it would seem legitimate to at least be converging to a halving on root prop. Right, like you can see where that train of thinking leads. Right, like I'm understanding what you're saying. So.
Yeah.
One other thing, if I might add, just about the whole. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Cool. This sort of does circle back to something that you said a bit earlier, Const. It's 3 a.m. Forgive me if I'm repeating a bit. In the commentary just around the concept of Tau root emissions, if they ever did go to zero or functionally near it, it's worth keeping in mind that also then, like, you're actively losing money by holding Tau, because Tau itself continues to inflate while you're gaining no advantage of that. It's like how the value of your dollar will decrease due to the inflation of the supply of dollars overall. It also then takes away the reason why to have it staked in the first place, which is taking away the security of the network, especially as we look to move away from POA to POS. It'll drive more people to go, well, if I'm not able to get any staking rewards, then why should I even have it on my own wallet? Why should I have it staked at all? Why not just have it at an exchange and be buying, maybe buying the dips, but also dumping on every pump? Because essentially at that stage, its purpose becomes something that you are able to capture the realized value on the price volatility, which is going to end up being a suppressive factor for as we try and hope Tau number go up. If every pump is going to be capped off by investors going, well, the only way that I'm able to make money on my Tau here is by selling it when the price pumps, and in the hope that number go down enough that I can buy it back. That's going to add a significant increase in the volatility of the token itself, which is also then undermining the stability of all of the dTao tokens, which, I mean, at the end of the day, we talk about commodifying intelligence and all of the rest of it, but the reality is that making all of this stuff is expensive. Staff need to be paid, servers need to be paid for. At the end of the day, you can only pay everyone so much in tokens until they need to realize some of that for rent. And if there's not some degree of stability within the subnets themselves, because the price of its exchangeable token back to Tau is flying between $10 and $1,000 every 6.5 minutes, then it becomes really bloody difficult to actually hire staff, have contracts, hire an office, sign longer equipment leases that might be on better terms, because ultimately you don't know what the next day is going to bring. So having that level of emission en route also serves as a stabilizing factor, where it's giving it's essentially paying dividends on the people that are adding value to the Tau in the first place and saying, hey, please don't constantly dump on this thing, because we do need some degree of stability in the ecosystem. So it is in some respects a rent, but it's also, as you said, it's providing an automated sell pressure on the subnets to make sure that crappy subnets are going to be pushed out of the ecosystem eventually. That's actually one of the things I miss the most about the old system of the validator voting, is that the validators whose job it is to protect the network, to keep everything working, we don't currently have a stick big enough to say this particular subnet is cancer. I want to smack it with a stick. That I think is something that is missing. But yeah, I digress. But yeah, so the emissions en route have multiple factors, from the stabilizing factor to prevent excessive overbought volatility, to be a downwards force on negative impacts, to be an encouragement to hold for those that provided the initial liquidity and value, and to be an encouragement to remain staked, which also helps to secure the network as a whole. So it does provide multiple layers of benefit. So I strongly disagree with the root doesn't do anything, the whales just sit here. The individual players on root might not be doing much, but collectively there is purpose to it.
Mm-hmm. It's important to mention, right? Like the yield on Tao itself, that's a consequence of Tao weight, which is a product of the productivity of the subnets. All of the subnet tokens are priced in Tao, and so if Tao itself performs well, right, the tokens themselves do well in dollar terms, and I think that we've talked about a lot of the different angles on this problem. What I've said is, like, I think that if anything changes here, we're going to come back with a proposal. It's going to take a long time. We're not moving this market in any way abruptly. Dave, it's been amazing to have you up on stage. Keith, it was amazing to have Keith on stage, and we've talked through some of these concepts, and hopefully that permeates out to the community. I think we've reached the end now. Let's stop it here. It was a pleasure to have her on stage. And thanks to the audience for coming along.
Bittensor on 3.
Bittensor on 3.
1, 2, 3. Bittensor!
Bittensor!
Yeah! Hey, let's ship. Let's do things. All right, good night.
Let's get Evil Concept on stage. Hell yeah. All right, guys. Ciao.
Bye.